It was time for me to graduate, move on to the next stage of life. And we all hit forks in the road, right? Should we go left or should we go right? Formula that I use to make decisions, which might be helpful for some of the listeners. It's important to ask for advice, and it's important to digest the advice, but you don't always have to take action on the advice. Moving on to the next stage. And so that's when I met you.
Yes.
I was just about to step out. I was just stepping out of the big corporate world when I met you.
Hello, Paul. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so happy to talk with you. Actually, this is our second time.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I interviewed Paul in actually this February, right after you established your new company, right?
That's right.
Yeah, he's an amazing person, entrepreneur, and also leadership educator. So today we can ask about his new transition from a big corporate to his own company. Okay? So tell us about yourself, Paul. What do you do in Tokyo and also global?
Wow, thank you. Shall I hold this? All right. Well, what a big question. First of all, thank you for having me. And I'm really enjoying your series. You have some great conversations with some really interesting, dynamic people. So thank you for having me. Well, it's hard to sum up, this journey, but I'll try to do it in a very short way. I arrived in Japan 34 years ago from Canada with a backpack. And I think about it now, the things you do when you're 22 years old, fearless, that spirit actually is really important, I think, for anybody who's looking at making a transition in their life. But for me, it was, come to Japan, I would stay 6 months, be a backpacker, go back to Canada, live happily ever after. Well, here we are 34 years later. Lots of things happened along the way. I stayed 5 years, went back to Canada to graduate school, became a high school teacher, back to Japan, continued in the education world. Then I had a bit of a turning point. I was always kind of interested in getting into business. So after more than 10 years in education, I switched completely, total different direction. I went into the recruitment world. And so I led a startup of a recruiting company, which was focused on mid-career executive search, especially bilingual talent in Japan. And we were very fortunate. We had a lot of success, grew it, and then we got bought. Our company got acquired. So I had the first experience of being involved in an M&A on the, let's say, being acquired side. And that was a company called N Japan, which is
Huge company.
listed, Tokyo Prime. Yeah, it's a very successful, one of the largest, if not the largest, job board, similar to Monster.com, Indeed, and so on in Japan. Then they asked me to stay on and lead the global expansion. So that was my first step out of the Japan, let's say, pond, the comfort zone, to Singapore. And then I was responsible for Asia, and then I was traveling all around Asia, and I got to see how each country is slightly different in terms of business culture and also local culture. But I also discovered how some things are universal. So that kind of started to form my ideas about leadership as well. And then I met a company called Randstad, which is the world's largest. Yeah, that's right. Two hands, yeah. Client, candidate, everyone together. And originally from the Netherlands. Number one company in the world, massive, 27 billion euro, huge company, 39 countries. And I joined Randstad in Japan, so I moved back to Japan. Since I speak Japanese and kind of can be that bridge between, let's say, global headquarters in Amsterdam and in Japan, understanding the Japanese context, that was kind of my role, was to help a very traditional domestic Japanese operation where nobody spoke English, help them become more global-minded. And not necessarily language, but more about mindset, innovation, which I know you're very passionate about, embracing technology, all that stuff. So that was quite interesting. And I had a good run there. And then I got a call from Amsterdam. Life-changing.
Yes.
Here we are. It's 2017, January. My big boss in Amsterdam said, Paul, things are going well for you in Japan. I said, yeah, thank you, Robert Jan. He said, good, time for a change. Okay, this is an important lesson. When you're in your comfort zone, actually, that is a moment of truth. Either you stay in the comfort zone or make a change. And what I've observed when I look around high performers, whether it's sports or business or arts, politics, whatever, content creators, they constantly challenge themselves to be out of their comfort zone. And when he said to me, hey, things are going well for you, it's time for a change, I had an aha moment. Yeah, he's right. And I thought, okay, what's next? In big global company, I had visions of like London, Paris, maybe New York, maybe Toronto even. And he said, how about India?
India.
Well, that was a big moment. I had never been to India. And it's interesting in reflection that I traveled all over Asia. I was leading Asia for Japan. I was visiting every country in Asia, and I never went to India. India is one of those countries that many companies dance around but never step into. It's complicated. It's intimidating, I think, and a lot of businesses have failed there. And so when I got the opportunity to go to India, I thought, wow, this can be a real game-changing moment. So long story short, moved to India, 2017. What I knew was that I was in for a really tough challenge. This company, we had 75,000 people in India. They were in the red, losing money. It had been around for several years, and so I knew I need to go there and make changes. I was sent there to be CEO. So I was going to be captain of this ship that was sinking with 75 offices across the country. I knew it was a huge challenge. I'm going to go alone for the first 4 months, and I'm just going to focus all of my energy and my heart and soul into this in the first 4 months to try to figure this out. And then I'll bring my family over. And so that's what we did. And it was good I did that, because what happened was I traveled the country. Every Monday morning I got on a plane from Bangor, where I was based, and I went and I visited many different cities. I visited people in the offices, colleagues. I visited clients. And I followed a mantra that my dad gave me when I was a kid. He used to say, hey, son, 2 ears, 1 mouth. 2 ears, 1 mouth.
2 ears and 1 mouth.
Which means listen more than you speak.
Listen more than you speak.
Especially important when you're going into unknown territory, where, completely new world, whatever it is you're doing, starting a new business or starting a new job or just moving to a new country, whatever. Listen more than you speak. And I thought, okay, so I'm going to take that stance. I'm going to meet 150 people in the organization, one-on-one, all over the country, and I'm going to listen. I'm going to ask questions. And the questions I asked was, 1, why did you join this company? 2, why do you stay in this company? Which is really important, huh? In the land of opportunity, you can always change. And 3, if there's one thing you could change about the company, what is it? And I had a notebook, and I wrote down all the answers. I filled like 2 notebooks full, and that became my treasure chest. So then the family came. I wrote a book about this. I actually got inspired to write a book about my journey in India and Japan. And so it's in quite detail. There's a lot of funny stories in there. Please, check out the book and you'll get the longer version. But then back to Japan. Things were going well. Same thing. Got a call. Paul, things are going well in India. We turned it around. It was growing fast. Number 1 performing country in the world of Randstad. Then the call came and said, how about Japan? Well, that was easy. So I moved back to Japan, became CEO of a $1.5 billion US operation in Japan, 95 offices in the country, 35,000 people, big, stable, good business. That was going well. And then it came that next turning point. And this was not because of the company, this was more because of inside me. It was time for me to graduate and move on to the next stage of life. And we all hit forks in the road, right? Should we go left or should we go right? Yes. And, I have a kind of a formula that I use to make decisions, which might be helpful for some of the listeners. It's important to ask for advice, and it's important to digest the advice, but you don't always have to take action on the advice. It's the important. I learned that as a leader when making decisions in the operations, where my leaders would say, no, we really should go this direction, but at the end of the day, I decided we're going this direction. You have to have guts sometimes and go against the general opinion. So I asked a lot of opinions about, what I was thinking about doing, going independent. And it was really interesting because, the people who were working in companies and stable and in comfort zone were encouraging me to stay. just stay it out. It's a
Yeah.
great job, great company, and so on. The people who were very entrepreneurial, the people who were a bit restless, I would say, curious, those seekers, they were the ones who said, come on, go for it. Why not? One life to live. So it's really interesting to see the different kinds of advice. But I was really leaning towards moving on to the next stage. And so that's when I met you.
Yes.
I was just about to step out. I was just stepping out of the big corporate world when I met you.
Yeah.
That was, 10 months ago, I guess, eh?
Yes.
Yeah.
You are right. So at that time, Paul gave me a new book.
The E5.
E5.
The rule. The E5 movement is
Yes.
the title.
And I read Japanese version.
Oh, yes.
And I wrote many line marker, because of a super impressive. One of the part which kept my heart was, of course, in India and in Japan, you have kept asking all employees 3 questions, right? And then after the result, you found almost all female employee had so creative idea. They wanted to change better their company, right? And almost I cried. Oh, it's good, because of they wanted to speak up or give some idea to top people, but company structure is kind of top down. But thanks to Paul came to each office to talk with all employee, they got this opportunity to talk with CEO directly, right?
Yeah.
I cried almost all.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's so great.
Thank you, and thanks for mentioning that. I did what I did in India, I did in Japan. And this is one of the lessons learned, is that some things about leadership are universal and borderless. We often talk, the culture is different, Japan is different. Let me tell you, India is different, and so is Canada, and so is Japan, and so on. It's not about what's different, it's what is universal for humans.
Humans.
And humans all want to be heard. We all want to have our voice heard. And so I traveled around Japan, same thing. And what I discovered, and I think we knew this already, is that there are some amazing women out there in Japan that are not being heard. And if we give them a chance to be heard, then of course we can do amazing things. But first they need to be heard. They have to have a voice. And so I embraced that challenge to give everyone a voice, not just women, of course, men as well, but give everyone a chance to speak up. And then ultimately, it kind of connected with my book, which the 5 E's, right?
Yes.
First is envision, next is express, next is excite, and then 4th is enable, and 5th is execute. Enabling leadership, that's kind of where I really focused in on enabling leadership and said, okay, my role as a leader every day, and I think every leader should take this stance at one point, your role is to come in every day, whether you come into an office physically or virtually, and be committed to enabling everybody around you to shine, to be the best true version of themselves, to leverage their natural brilliance, because we're all naturally good at something, right? And so that's the role of the leaders, to help everybody shine. And when people are shining, how do they feel? Happy. And when they're happy, they're motivated. And when they're motivated, they come up with great ideas. They raise their hand to take the lead. And so I started to see that in Japan as well, when I spent time listening and giving a voice to the women around the organization, that we had some amazing creative ideas which were rooted in being better than yesterday, giving great service to our customers, doing it with heart. So all of these really important initiatives, or I should say many of the important initiatives were born from the ideas of women around the organization. Yeah. So
Yes.
2 ears, 1 mouth. For all the guys out there, let's make sure we listen a little bit more, because as leaders we get caught in a trap, and I did too. I'm guilty. We get caught being the leader who tells more than listens, because that's the leadership we all grew up with. That's certainly my generation. The leader was somebody who knows. But now, if you want to know anything, you just go on ChatGPT.
Yeah.
ChatGPT knows a lot more than I do, right? So the role of the leader is now about knowing. It's not about knowing anymore. It's more about enabling. Enabling. So enabling leadership for me is a key point. Yeah.
I see. Thank you so much. Okay, next question. So this year, I think February, you left big company, you started to your own company. So let's talk about your company. So company name, and then basically what kind of responsibility or work do you do?
Sure. So the big moment came where I announced that I was going to graduate, not retire, not resign. Although my friends all tease me, "Oh, Paul, you're retired. How's retirement like?" Well, let me tell you, I'm not retired. Not even close. I don't think I'll ever retire. You know, it's important to get up in the morning, have something to do with purpose. So I launched I went to bed on January 31st this year, and I was CEO of a $1.5 billion company with 95 offices, 35,000 people, and then I woke up February 1st and everything was blank. Of course, I couldn't log into my system because I was done in the company. My calendar was pure white. I can't remember the last time I saw a blank calendar with no appointments, because we all get caught in that back-to-back trap of busyness. And I thought, wow, what a wonderful opportunity. Now what? So, I built my company based on a few key pillars. I'd like to maybe draw an image of a pie. If you take a pie, right, and how I spend my time. So first, I'm on the board of a Japanese company. I'm a non-exec director, which means independent director. In Japanese, shagai torishimaku, right? Non-exec director of a Japanese company in an industry I know nothing about, fragrance and flavor. It's a company called Hasegawa Koryo. Fragrance and flavor. It's a very interesting industry. It's B2B. Everything we drink, we eat, the shampoos, the soaps used, all has either fragrance or flavor or both in them. And that's done by companies like Hasegawa. Wonderful company on a mission to go global. So I'm one of a few non-Japanese sitting on board of Japanese listed company, which is a really interesting experience. And I'm helping them globalize. Then I'm teaching a course at Globus University in the MBA program on leadership and organizational development. Really enjoy that. These are future aspiring leaders, and I'm really motivated by being around future leaders who are hungry. Beyond that, I'm also an external advisor to Bain Consulting. Bain is one of the big four consulting firms, and so they approached me to help them on global projects. So I advise Bain all over the world on various projects. Sometimes it's a Japanese company that's struggling to be future ready. They need to make change to the organization, or they need to embrace technology. Maybe it's a people issue, whatever. I advise. And then there could be a company in England that's facing a different kind of challenge, or maybe it's an M&A. There's something called PMI, right? Post-merger integration, and so on. So I'm advising various companies on various projects through Bain. And I also am doing some advisory with companies in India that want to enter Japan. So helping Indian companies come into Japan. Japan is a very attractive market, but for Indian companies, it's also a bit scary and mysterious, right? Japan's not an easy country to enter if you're a foreign company, so I help that. And then vice versa, Japanese companies trying to go to India. Exact same story. There's challenges, expanding into India, and I can help make that happen. Also writing another book. As you mentioned, my Japanese book came out. It became a bestseller, knock on wood. So thank you for all of those folks out there who bought it. And I'm also getting close to confirming that my book will be released in Korean and also in Hindi, the same book. And again, I'm working on another book, so that's fun. Beyond that, I'm traveling a lot. I'm doing some keynote speaking here and there. I'm doing a bit of coaching, one-on-one coaching with CE or CXO levels in Japan and beyond, around different countries. Some are virtual, some are in person. I also created something I'm really excited about, and this is taking a big piece of my pie. It's called the Future Ready Leadership Gym.
Okay, what is this?
Well, think about it like this. Do you go to the gym? Do you ever go to the gym?
I do, like yoga studio.
Okay. So let's call that a gym, because you're going in there with a purpose to get healthy, right? So typically in a gym, let's talk about a fitness gym for a moment. And when you walk into a fitness gym,
you can use your hand.
Okay. Yes. In a fitness gym, you have machines, right? Typically, you've got machines all around the room, right? And when we walk in the gym, you might say, "Oh, okay, this machine's open. I'll sit here and I'll do the machine," right? Okay. On the other hand, you may go in and say, "You know what? No, today I'm going to focus on, instead of muscles, I'm going to focus on stamina. I'm going to go on the running machine, or I'm going to go on the stair climber machine." Okay. Typically, you walk in the gym with some kind of purpose. If you're really focused and you're a real, let's say, athlete, committed athlete, You have a clear plan. You even have a notebook. I'm going to work this, and this. And you have a clear purpose. Okay. And I had this idea, actually, it was on one of my morning walks, because I walk every morning. That's where I think, it's my morning walks. And I thought, you know what? Leadership is just like walking into a gym. It's like fitness. We build the muscles for a purpose. Well, leadership is actually a series of muscles that can be built. Every single one of those muscles can be built, right? That's why leaders are not born, they're made. You become a leader through effort. It's not magical. You don't get a business card and says, today you're CEO, oh, suddenly I'm a great leader. That's not how it works. You have to put in the work to build the leadership muscles. So I created a concept, the Future Ready Leadership Gym. And it's a series of exercises. Again, think about muscle. And it's actually a video series. So it's an e-learning, micro-learning series. I recorded it in Bangalore at a studio. I've got a production team there, put it all together. It's a 15-part video series, 5 to 7 minutes each clip. At the end of each video, there are exercises. So now it's your turn. And, the participant does the exercises, comes on to the next video. After they finish the 15 videos, then there's a mastermind workshop, which is interactive, in person, that I facilitate with leadership teams. So I've been doing this, and I really enjoy it, I have to say. Doing it in Japan, I'm doing it in India, and looking at Korea next, and it's really interesting. So to help leaders build the muscles to be future ready. Yeah.
I love this idea. How? Okay, so it's your idea, right? But totally agree. So even creativity, even leadership, of course, some people say nature, but I would say nurture. We have to training every single day, and then we have to improve, and also we have to keep our muscle.
Oh, absolutely true. Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned nature versus nurture. I don't think there's any such thing as born something. Yeah. No, we may be born with preference for something. Yeah. We might prefer, music versus sports or whatever. It doesn't make you good at it. It just means you prefer it. And then you put in the hard work, right? I love music. Okay, now I'm going to learn how to play the instrument. And it's the same thing with sports. I love sports. Okay, I'm going to build the muscles and the skills needed. So yeah, for sure. And I think, the wonderful thing about human beings, we can wake up in the morning and decide, you know what, today I'm going to learn Chinese. I'm going to start learning Chinese. Or today I'm going to start learning how to play the guitar. I mean, we have the ability to wake up in the morning and make that decision. But then we have to put in the work. So it's the same as the gym concept. If you say, hey, I really want to be a leader, not just a leader. I want to be a great leader. I want to be a game-changing leader. Okay, let's go to the gym. Let's make it happen. And by the way, that's what I mentioned earlier about enabling leadership. So what I'm doing now, if you ask me to summarize what I do, I enable leaders and companies to be future ready.
Okay. The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Paul, part 1. 1. Transition requires bold decisions and self-reflection. Paul's journey from being a CEO in a 1.5 billion corporation to sharing his own company highlights the importance of stepping out of comfort zone. He transitioned from a stable corporate role to launching multiple ventures, including the Future Ready Leadership Gym. This gym equips leaders with muscle building exercise to prepare them for future challenges, underscoring that leadership is not innate but nurtured through consistent effort and training. Okay? 2. Listening is a universal leadership skill. One of Paul's guiding principles is a mantra his father taught him. 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen more than you speak. He applied this during his leadership roles in India and Japan by asking employees 3 crucial questions. Why do you join this company? Why do you stay? If you could change of this one thing, what would it be? By listening to their response, he uncovered creative ideas, particularly from women employees who often felt unheard. This practice not only fostered innovation but also empowered employees, leading better performance and morale. 3. Enabling leadership is the key to motivation and growth. Paul empowers that leader's role is to enable everyone around them to shine. He shared how enabling leadership motivates individuals to leverage their unique talent. For example, while in Japan, his approach of amplifying voice led to initiatives that improved customer service and fostered a positive work culture. His 5 E's of leadership. This is his book. Envision, express, excite, enable, and execute. Serve as a practical framework for driving organizational success through empowerment. Okay, thank you so much for watching our podcast today. We hope our story will help your future and career. If you like our conversation, please subscribe it and give you a like. And next episode, conversation with Paul part 2. Okay, bye bye, stay tuned.